Bank teller laughs at single dad's loan request. Her boss personally approves it within hours. She mocked him for being broke, then watched in shock as her own boss rushed out, shook his hand, and said the words that would change every life in that bank forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The February morning air bit through Ethan Carter's worn jacket like a blade as he walked along the snow-dusted sidewalk. His 8-year-old daughter Lila's small hand tucked warmly in his. Her mittens, one blue, one green, from the school's lost and found box, felt soft against his work-roughened palm. The sky hung low and gray over their small Ohio town, heavy with the promise of more snow, but Lila's cheerful humming of a half-remembered Sunday school song brightened the dreary day like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Watch out for that icy patch, sweetheart," Ethan warned gently, his breath creating small white puffs in the frigid air as he guided Lila around a slippery section of concrete where yesterday's slush had frozen overnight. Her tattered purple backpack, a donation from the church rummage sale that she'd proudly decorated with flower stickers, bounced against her winter coat as she skipped beside him, her dark braids swaying with each carefree step. "Daddy, look!" Lila pointed at a bright red cardinal perched on a nearby fence post, its vibrant feathers stark against the pristine white snow covering the wooden slats. "It's so red against the snow, like Mom's favorite flowers." Ethan's heart squeezed tight at the mention of Sarah, the familiar ache rising in his chest like floodwater. Even after 3 years, his late wife's absence felt like a fresh wound some days, especially on mornings like this, when the winter light reminded him of how she loved to watch cardinals at their kitchen window. "That's right, honey, red carnations. She loved those more than any other flower in the world." Lila nodded solemnly, her breath creating little clouds in the cold air that danced and disappeared like tiny spirits. "Do you think we'll be able to plant some this spring? In our yard? Maybe by the kitchen window where she used to like to sit?" "I hope so, sweetheart." Ethan adjusted his grip on the manila folder he carried, the one containing all his careful plans and dreams typed on library computer paper. The edges were already wearing soft from his nervous handling. "Things are going to get better soon, I promise. This could be the start of something really good for us." "I know they will," Lila said, with the complete conviction that only children possess, her voice carrying a certainty that made his chest tight with emotion. "You always fix everything, Daddy. You're magic with broken things." Her unwavering faith in him made his throat constrict until he could barely swallow. If only fixing their life was as simple as replacing a broken pipe or patching a leaky roof, things he could solve with his hands and the right tools. The odd jobs that had sustained them since the factory closure barely covered their basic needs, leaving little room for anything beyond survival. They passed Mrs. Henderson's small frame house, where Ethan had repaired the front steps last week after she'd taken a scary tumble on the ice. The elderly woman appeared at her lace-curtained window and waved enthusiastically, her wrinkled face creased in a warm smile. Lila waved back with both hands, nearly losing her balance in her enthusiasm. "Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that her friend, Mrs. Peterson, needs help with her garage door," Lila reported, importantly, puffing up with pride at being trusted with grown-up information. "It gets stuck every time she tries to open it. I told her you're the best at fixing things in the whole world." "That's very kind of you to say, Princess." Ethan smiled despite the worry gnawing at his stomach like a persistent hunger. Word of mouth. Jobs weren't enough anymore, not with Lila growing so fast and winter heating bills eating through their small savings. They needed something more stable, something that could give them a real future instead of just day-to-day survival. The elementary school came into view around the corner, its solid brick walls reassuring and permanent against the winter landscape. Other parents and children converged on the entrance from different directions, their conversations creating a soft morning buzz that spoke of normal lives and predictable routines, things Ethan desperately wanted to give his daughter. Lila's teacher, Miss Roberts, stood at the main door greeting students as she did every morning, rain or shine. Her kind brown eyes met Ethan's across the schoolyard, and she gave him an understanding nod that somehow conveyed both sympathy and encouragement. She knew their situation all too well, had seen Lila wearing the same clothes a little too often, had quietly slipped extra snacks and supplies into Lila's desk when she thought no one was looking. Teachers like her were angels walking the earth. "Have a great day at school, Princess." Ethan knelt down to Lila's level on the cold concrete, his knees protesting the movement after yesterday's roofing job. He straightened her mismatched mittens with gentle fingers, making sure her coat was zipped all the way up against the bitter wind. "You too, Daddy." Lila threw her thin arms around his neck with fierce love, her small body warm and solid against him. "Good luck at the bank today. Remember what you always tell me when something feels scary?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "Nothing's impossible with enough heart," she recited like a sacred prayer, grinning up at him with gap-toothed confidence that could have powered the whole town. Ethan swallowed hard against the emotion, threatening to overwhelm him, and hugged her close, breathing in the sweet smell of her strawberry shampoo, a small luxury he'd splurged on last week, because it made her eyes light up with joy. "That's right, baby girl. That's exactly right. You remember that today too, okay?" He watched her skip up the concrete steps, her dark braids bouncing with each step like little pendulums, keeping time with her happiness. "Miss?" Roberts placed a gentle, protective hand on Lila's shoulder as she passed through the doorway, and Ethan silently thanked God for people like her who helped cushion his daughter from the harder edges of their reality. Teachers who saw beyond worn clothes to the bright spirit underneath. Walking back across the empty parking lot to his truck, Ethan's work boots crunched through the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, leaving deep prints in the pristine white surface. The old pickup sat alone under a bare oak tree, its red paint faded to a dull rust in places where time and weather had worn it thin. He climbed into the cab, his breath immediately fogging in the cold interior, and set the precious folder carefully on the cracked vinyl passenger seat. Inside those manila covers were the documents he'd spent weeks preparing with meticulous care. His business plan for Carter's home repairs, carefully typed during late-night sessions at the library computer when Lila was asleep. Market research showing the growing need for reliable handyman services in their aging community, where half the houses were older than he was. A detailed budget listing every tool he'd need to expand beyond basic repairs, the circular saw, the commercial-grade drill set, the van that would let him carry more than his pickup bed could hold, 3 years of tax returns that proved he could squeeze blood from a stone when it came to managing money, making every dollar stretch until it screamed. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with both hands, its cracked leather familiar under his calloused palms. The engine coughed and wheezed to life on the second try, settling into the rough idle that meant it needed work he couldn't afford. He sat there letting it warm up, watching his breath fog the windshield while the heater tried valiantly to push tepid air through vents that had seen better decades. "Nothing's impossible with enough heart," he whispered into the cold silence, echoing Lila's words like a prayer. The phrase had started as something he'd say to encourage her when she struggled with homework or felt sad about not having what other kids had. But somehow his wise daughter had turned it back on him, making him believe it might actually be true. He thought of Sarah, how she'd always believed in his potential even when he doubted himself completely, how she'd encouraged him to finish his technical certification even when money was tight and time was short. "Watch over us today," he murmured, touching the simple gold wedding ring he still wore after 3 long years. "Help me do this right. Help me be the man she thought I could be. For our girl." The heater finally began pushing genuinely warm air through the vents, and Ethan could feel sensation returning to his fingertips. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the empty parking lot, pointing the dented hood toward Midland Savings Bank downtown. The folder seemed to pulse with possibility beside him, containing either the key to their future or just another dead end in a series of closed doors. But Lila's absolute faith echoed in his mind, stronger than his fears and louder than the doubts that tried to creep in. His daughter believed in him with the fierce certainty of someone who had never learned that the world could be cruel to people like them. And maybe, just maybe, that innocent faith would be enough to help him believe in himself long enough to walk through those bank doors and ask for a chance. The glass doors of Midland Savings Bank swooshed open, bringing a blast of warm air that fogged Ethan's glasses. He blinked, adjusting to the bright fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and clinical. The lobby hummed, with quiet activity, the shuffling of papers, the soft beeping of computers, the murmur of voices discussing mortgages and interest rates. Ethan's work boots squeaked against the polished floor as he approached the teller counter, leaving small wet marks from the melting snow. He clutched his folder tighter, trying to draw strength from the careful plans inside. The manila edges were slightly worn from how many times he'd reviewed everything, making sure each detail was perfect. Behind the counter, Samantha Price looked up from her computer screen. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, not a strand out of place. Her navy blazer and crisp white blouse screamed professional confidence. The name tag pinned to her chest gleamed under the lights. "Good morning," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "How can I help you today?" "Good morning, miss." "Price." Ethan cleared his throat, willing his voice to sound steady. "I'd like to apply for a small business loan, please." He placed the folder on the counter, sliding it toward her with hands that weren't quite steady. Samantha's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly as she took in his appearance. The worn jacket, the calloused hands, the scuffed boots. "Of course," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. She opened the folder with manicured fingers, her red nails stark against the white papers inside. "I've prepared a complete business plan," Ethan explained, pointing to the first page. "I'm looking to expand my handyman service into a proper business. There's market research showing the need in our community, and I've included 3 years of tax returns to show." Samantha cut him off, flipping through the pages with barely a glance. Her lips twitched as though fighting back a smile. "And what collateral are you offering?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I have some savings, not much, but it's a start. And my truck? Tools." He trailed off as Samantha's expression shifted from polite disinterest to barely concealed amusement. "Your truck?" She glanced through the bank's front windows at his rusted pickup. A small laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. The sound drew the attention of other customers. An elderly couple waiting in line exchanged glances. A businessman in an expensive suit looked over, then quickly away, as if embarrassed for Ethan. Heat crept up Ethan's neck, spreading across his face. He thought of Lila's mismatched mittens, of the careful budget he'd worked out that would let them buy her new clothes for school next year. He thought of the hours spent at the library, researching successful small businesses, learning terms like projected revenue and operating costs. Samantha shuffled the papers back together, not bothering to align them neatly. Her smile had transformed into something closer to a smirk. "Honey," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "this isn't a charity. We're a bank. We need real collateral, real business experience." She pushed the folder back across the counter. "You'd need more than a prayer to get this approved." A few customers behind Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. The fluorescent light suddenly seemed too bright, too exposing. His fingers trembled as he reached for the folder. All those hours of planning, of hoping, of believing things could be different, reduced to a joke by someone who'd probably never had to check her account balance before buying groceries. "I understand," he managed to say, though his throat felt tight. "Thank you for your time." He gathered the papers, trying to tuck them neatly back into the folder, but fumbling in his haste to escape. A page slipped free, floating to the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, he heard Samantha's quiet snicker. "Excuse me, Miss Price?" The new voice cut through the humiliation like a cool breeze. Calm, authoritative, but gentle somehow. Ethan straightened up, paper in hand, and turned toward its source. A woman in her early 60s stood near the manager's office. Her silver hair was styled simply but elegantly, and her eyes held a warmth that seemed out of place in the sterile bank environment. Her nameplate read, "Margaret Hayes, branch manager." "Could you bring those documents to my office, please?" Margaret's tone was pleasant but left no room for argument. Samantha's superior smile faltered. "Mrs. Hayes, I was just explaining to this gentleman that his application doesn't meet our basic requirements for the documents." "Miss Price." Margaret's voice remained kind, but something in it made Samantha's mouth snap shut. "Bring them to my office. Now, please." Ethan stood frozen, unsure whether to stay or flee. The folder in his hands seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Around him, the bank's usual activity had gone oddly quiet, as though everyone was holding their breath. "Mr. Carter?" Margaret gestured toward her office door. "Would you join me, please?" Margaret Hayes' office felt different from the Stark Bank lobby. Sunbeams danced through delicate lace curtains, warming the worn leather chairs and casting gentle shadows across the carpet. Family photos and simple wooden frames lined her desk, their faces smiling warmly at visitors. "Please, Mr. Carter, have a seat." Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk. Her voice carried the kind of warmth that reminded Ethan of his grandmother's kitchen on Sunday afternoons. Ethan lowered himself into the chair, still clutching his folder of documents. His work-roughened hands smoothed down the creased papers nervously. "Would you like some coffee?" Margaret asked, indicating a small coffee maker in the corner. "I always keep a fresh pot going. My little luxury during long days." "No, thank you, ma'am." Ethan replied softly. "I appreciate the offer, though." Margaret settled into her chair, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She didn't reach for the loan application right away. Instead, she folded her hands on her desk and looked at Ethan with genuine interest. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Carter. How long have you lived in town?" "All my life," Ethan answered, his shoulders relaxing slightly at the simple question. "Born at County General, just like my daughter Lila." Margaret nodded, glancing at one of her photos. "Children have a way of anchoring us to a place, don't they? How old is your little girl?" 8. A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "She's in 3rd grade at Roosevelt Elementary, smart as a whip, just like her mother was." "Was?" Margaret's voice softened with understanding. Ethan's hands tightened slightly on the folder. "Sarah, my wife. She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." He swallowed hard. "She was a kindergarten teacher at Roosevelt, actually. The kids still leave flowers by her classroom door sometimes." Margaret reached for a tissue box, quietly sliding it closer to Ethan. He didn't take one, but the gesture meant something. "I worked at the Riverside manufacturing plant for 12 years, Ethan continued, his voice steadying. "Started right out of high school, worked my way up to maintenance supervisor. Good job, solid benefits. Then the overseas competition hit, and well," he shrugged. "The movement carrying the weight of countless similar stories in their small town. The layoffs last summer," Margaret nodded. "That affected so many families here." "Yeah." Ethan sat up straighter. "But I've been doing odd jobs since then. Handyman work, repairs, whatever people need. Word's gotten around that I do good work. Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street. She tells all her church friends about how I fixed her furnace in the middle of that cold snap last month." Margaret smiled. "Betty Henderson is quite the influencer in her circle. If you've won her approval, that's saying something." For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of pride. "I've been keeping track of every job, every penny earned." He opened his folder, pulling out meticulously maintained records. "It's not much, but I've saved what I could, and I've got a solid business plan. People around here need someone they can trust for repairs, someone who won't overcharge or cut corners." Margaret took the papers, studying them with careful attention. "You've certainly done your homework, Mr. Carter. These projections are realistic, conservative even, and your attention to detail is impressive." "I know my credit isn't perfect," Ethan admitted. "The medical bills from Sarah's treatment, but I've never missed a payment. It's just been slow going, paying them down." Margaret removed her glasses, looking directly at Ethan. "Mr. Carter, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, ma'am. What drives you? Why this business? Why now?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "It's about dignity, I suppose, and stability for Lila." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I want my daughter to see that hard times don't have to break you, that you can build something honest and good from nothing but faith and hard work." He glanced at the photos on Margaret's desk. "I want to be someone she can be proud of, someone who didn't give up when things got tough." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes bright with understanding. She picked up Ethan's loan application, studying it again. "I'm going to review this personally," she said finally. "Every detail, every number. But Mr. Carter?" She smiled gently. "Sometimes numbers don't tell the whole story." Ethan stood, hope flickering in his chest for the first time since entering the bank. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I can't tell you what this means." "You just did," she replied softly. The kitchen was filled with the warm scent of toast and eggs as Ethan stood at the stove, carefully flipping an omelet for Lila's breakfast. Morning sunlight streamed through the small window above the sink, catching the steam rising from his coffee mug. The kitchen, though modest, was spotless, a testament to Ethan's dedication to providing a proper home for his daughter despite their struggles. "Is it almost ready, Dad?" Lila asked from the table, swinging her legs as she colored in her notebook. Her half-braided hair caught the light, reminding Ethan he still needed to finish fixing it before school. "Just about, sweetie. Let me get this." The phone's sharp ring cut through the peaceful morning routine. Ethan quickly moved the pan off the heat and reached for his cell phone, not recognizing the number. "Hello? Mr. Carter? This is Margaret Hayes from Midland Savings Bank." Her warm voice carried a note of enthusiasm that made his heart skip. Yes, Mrs. Hayes. "Good morning." Ethan gripped the counter's edge, his knuckles turning white. "I have some news for you." There was a pause, and Ethan could hear papers shuffling. I've just finished reviewing your loan application, and I wanted to let you know personally, it's been approved. The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways. Ethan's legs went weak, and he dropped heavily into one of the wooden kitchen chairs. What? The loan has been approved, Mr. Carter. I've signed off on it myself. Margaret's voice was gentle, understanding the weight of her words. We can have the paperwork ready for you to sign this afternoon, if that works for you. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. He felt something wet on his cheek and realized he was crying. Lila looked up from her coloring, concern crossing her young face. Daddy, are you okay? He nodded quickly, giving her a wobbly smile as he wiped his eyes with his free hand. Mrs. Hayes, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Margaret replied kindly. Just come by the bank at 2 o'clock, and we'll get everything finalized. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. His voice cracked on the last word. After they hung up, Ethan sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. Lila pushed back her chair and came around the table, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Why are you crying, Daddy? Ethan pulled her into a proper hug, lifting her onto his lap. Remember how I told you I was trying to start my own repair business? She nodded against his shoulder. Well, the nice lady at the bank is going to help us make that happen. Lila pulled back, her face lighting up. Really? You mean you can fix things for everybody now? That's right, sweetheart. He laughed, the sound full of relief and joy. And you know what else? This means we might be able to get you those new shoes you need. The sparkly ones? Her eyes went wide. We'll see about the sparkles? He chuckled, standing up and setting her back on her feet. But first, let's finish getting ready for school. Your omelet's getting cold. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. After dropping Lila off at school, Ethan drove home and spent an hour making sure his best shirt was properly ironed. He polished his old dress shoes until they gleamed and carefully organized all his documents into a new folder he'd bought specially for this purpose. At precisely 2 o'clock, Ethan walked through the bank's glass doors, his heart thundering in his chest but his head held high. The lobby seemed different today, brighter, more welcoming. A few customers milled about, and the afternoon sun cast long rectangles of light across the marble floor. Margaret met him near the entrance, her smile warm and genuine. Right on time, Mr. Carter. Please, follow me to my office. As they walked past the teller windows, Ethan caught sight of Samantha Price. She sat at her station, watching their passage with narrowed eyes and a tight-lipped frown. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped an irritated rhythm on her desk, but Ethan barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the future that was suddenly, miraculously, opening up before him. Margaret's office felt different too. Yesterday, it had seemed like a place of judgment, where dreams would live or die. Today, it felt like a sanctuary of hope. She settled behind her desk and began laying out papers with practiced efficiency. Now, Mr. Carter, I'll need you to sign here, here, and here, she said, pointing to various marked spots on the documents. This indicates your acceptance of the loan terms we discussed, and this one acknowledges receipt of the funds, which will be deposited directly into your new business account. Ethan's hand was steady as he signed each paper, though his heart still raced. When he reached the final document, he paused, looking up at Margaret. Mrs. Hayes, I want you to know, this means everything to me and Lila. I promise you won't regret taking this chance. Margaret's eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. I know I won't, Mr. Carter. Sometimes you can just tell when someone has what it takes. She accepted the last signed paper and stood, extending her hand. Now, go make us proud. Ethan grasped her hand firmly, noting how strong her handshake was despite her gentle demeanor. As he turned to leave, he caught Samantha's eye through the office window. Her frown had deepened, and she quickly looked away, shuffling papers on her desk with unnecessary force. But nothing could dim the light of this moment. Ethan walked out of the bank, documents tucked safely in his folder, feeling 10 feet tall. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, a text from Lila's after-school program reminding him of pickup time. He smiled, knowing that for the first time in a long while, he could tell his daughter with complete certainty that things were getting better. The February morning dawned crisp and clear as Ethan pulled his old pickup truck into the parking lot of Store All Storage on the outskirts of town. His breath made little clouds in the cold air as he filled out rental papers for the smallest unit they had, just big enough for his tools and a tiny workspace. The monthly fee would be tight, but it was a start. Unit 17B is all yours, Mr. Carter, the manager said, handing over a key attached to a plastic orange tag. It's not much, but it's clean and dry, Ethan nodded gratefully. That's all I need. He spent the next few hours at secondhand stores and pawn shops, carefully selecting used tools. Each purchase was a calculated decision, a reliable power drill here, a sturdy toolbox there. He checked every item thoroughly, testing switches and examining for wear. His years at the factory had taught him what quality looked like, even in used equipment. At Mike's Hardware, the owner recognized him from his factory days. "Heard you got yourself a loan to start up," Mike said, adjusting his glasses. "About time someone gave you a chance." "Margaret Hayes at Midland Bank," Ethan replied, testing the grip of a used hammer. "She believed in me." Mike nodded approvingly. "Good woman, that Margaret. Known her for years." Here, he pushed forward a slightly scratched but professional-grade circular saw. "I'll give you a fair price on this one. Every handyman needs a good saw." By early afternoon, Ethan had his basic kit assembled. He arranged everything carefully in the storage unit, making sure each tool had its place. The space wasn't much, but standing there surrounded by his equipment, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. His phone rang, his first official job. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly widow from church, needed her back fence repaired where winter storms had knocked it down. "I know it's your first day," she said apologetically, "but the neighbor's dog keeps getting in my garden." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Ethan promised. The fence repair took most of the afternoon. Ethan worked steadily, replacing rotted posts and securing loose boards. Mrs. Peterson brought him hot coffee and watched from her back porch. "You do good work," she observed as he finished up. "Clean and careful, just like your father used to be." Ethan smiled, remembering how his dad had taught him to use tools when he was barely bigger than Lila. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll tell my bridge club about you," she said, writing out a check. Heaven knows they're always complaining about finding reliable help. Meanwhile, across town at Midland Savings Bank, the morning staff meeting had just ended. Samantha lingered by the break room coffee machine with Lisa from accounting, stirring her coffee with quick, irritated movements. "I just don't understand what Mrs. Hayes was thinking," she muttered. "A single dad with no business experience? The guy can barely afford his daughter's school supplies." Lisa glanced around nervously. "Well, she's been here forever. Maybe she saw something in his application?" "Please," Samantha scoffed. "She's getting soft. Remember last month when she let the Wilson family delay their mortgage payment? This isn't a charity, it's a bank." "But the Wilsons did catch up," Lisa pointed out. "That's not the point." Samantha tossed her stir in the trash with more force than necessary. "We have procedures for a reason. What happens when he defaults? Corporate's going to come down hard, and guess who'll have to deal with all the paperwork? Me." Their voices carried through the open break room door, where Margaret stood quietly in the hallway, unseen. She heard the doubt in their words, the judgment in their tones. It wasn't the first time she'd overheard such conversations since approving Ethan's loan. Walking back to her office, Margaret passed the wall of bank founders' portraits, stern-faced men in old-fashioned suits who'd probably never approved a loan based on character alone. But times were different then. Communities were closer. People knew each other's worth beyond just numbers on paper. She settled into her chair and turned to look out her window at the town square below. The afternoon sun caught the steeple of First Methodist, where she and her late husband had attended for 40 years. He would have understood her decision about Ethan's loan. Sometimes, he used to say, you have to trust in people's potential. Margaret folded her hands quietly and closed her eyes. "Lord," she whispered, "watch over that young man and his daughter. Help him prove them wrong." At that moment, Ethan was finishing up his second job of the day, fixing a leaking faucet for one of Mrs. Peterson's bridge club friends. The woman had already called her sister to recommend him. As the sun began to set, he picked up Lila from the after-school program. She climbed into the truck, her face brightening at the sight of his toolbox in the back. "Did you fix lots of things today, Daddy?" "I sure did, sweetheart." He helped her buckle her seatbelt. "And tomorrow, I'm going to fix even more." Word was already spreading through the quiet neighborhoods and church circles, the kind of gentle gossip that moved like wind through wheat in small towns. There was a new handyman in town, they said. A good man, reliable, honest, fair with his prices, a single dad trying to make good. But in the bank's break room, a different kind of talk continued to spread. Whispers about Margaret's judgment, questions about protocol. Samantha's voice just a little too loud. The boss is losing her touch. We'll all pay for it when this falls apart. And in her office, Margaret kept her quiet vigil at the window, her faith steady as the sunset, painting the sky beyond the town square. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Anderson's worn wooden porch as Ethan Carter knelt to examine the rotting boards. The elderly widow stood nearby, wringing her hands in worry. Her small frame seemed even more diminutive as she watched him work. "I'm so sorry to waste your time, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "I didn't realize how expensive new boards would be. I should have checked my savings first." Ethan stood up, brushing sawdust from his jeans. He looked at the woman who reminded him so much of his own grandmother. The same kind eyes, the same worried expression when money came up. The porch definitely needed work. 3 boards were completely rotted through, and the steps creaked dangerously. "Mrs. Anderson, did you know my daughter Lila loves your cookie recipe?" he asked, changing the subject. "The one you shared at church last month?" The old woman's face brightened. "Oh, the snickerdoodles? They were my Harold's favorite too, God rest his soul." Ethan nodded, making up his mind. "Tell you what, why don't you teach Lila how to make those cookies properly? That'll be payment enough for fixing this porch." "Oh, I couldn't possibly," Mrs. Anderson protested. "I insist," Ethan said firmly, already pulling tools from his truck. "Besides, I bought extra lumber last week. These boards need to be put to good use." 2 hours later, the news was already spreading through Mary's diner downtown. Mrs. Anderson's neighbor had seen Ethan working and called her sister, who worked as a waitress there. By lunchtime, the story of the handyman who fixed a widow's porch for cookies was making its way through the small town's grapevine. At Midland Savings Bank, Margaret Hayes heard snippets of the story from customers waiting in line. Each version added new details, but the heart remained the same. Ethan Carter, the man she'd taken a chance on, was proving to be exactly the kind of person she'd believed him to be. "Did you hear about that handyman?" one elderly customer asked while Margaret helped him with his deposit. "Fixed Mary Anderson's whole porch for nothing but some baking lessons for his little girl. Now that's the kind of business we need more of in this town." Margaret's eyes crinkled with pride. "Yes, mister. Carter is certainly making a name for himself." A few feet away, Samantha Price's fingers tightened around her pen as she processed another transaction. All morning long, she'd had to listen to customers praising Ethan Carter. Every story made her stomach twist with irritation. Didn't they understand that business wasn't about charity? That man was going to fail, and when he did, it would reflect badly on the whole bank. During her lunch break, instead of joining her coworkers in the break room, Samantha sat at her desk. She pulled up Ethan's loan application on her computer, scanning through his financial history with narrow eyes. There had to be something she'd missed, something that would prove she'd been right about him all along. "Past due notices on medical bills?" she muttered, making notes. "Late mortgage payment last year." She dug deeper, looking for patterns, convinced that beneath his good guy facade lay the proof that Margaret had made a mistake. The afternoon dragged on, each tick of the clock accompanied by another customer's glowing praise of Ethan Carter. By closing time, Samantha's frustration had reached a breaking point. As other employees gathered their things to leave, she remained at her desk, waiting. Once the lobby was empty, she walked to the filing cabinet where hard copies of recent loans were kept. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she located Ethan's file and carried it to her desk. She didn't notice Margaret standing in her office doorway, watching silently as Samantha spread the papers across her workspace. "This has to be here somewhere," Samantha mumbled, flipping through pages of financial statements and credit reports. "Nobody's this perfect. Nobody just decides to fix things for free when they have loans to repay." She was so absorbed in her search that she didn't hear the soft sigh from Margaret's direction, didn't see the way her boss's shoulders dropped with disappointment. All Samantha could focus on were the numbers in front of her, determined to prove that her initial judgment of Ethan Carter had been right, even if she had to stay all night to do it. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across her desk as she hunched over the scattered papers, unaware that her actions were painting a clearer picture of her own character than any flaw she might find in Ethan's file. Margaret stood in her doorway a moment longer, watching her young employee's determined investigation. The scene before her spoke volumes. Samantha Price, surrounded by paper proof of someone else's hardships, searching for failure instead of hoping for success. With one last look at the scene, Margaret quietly gathered her belongings, leaving Samantha alone with her bitter task. The morning sun streamed through Margaret's office window as she watched Samantha organize files at her desk. Something about the young woman's determined expression troubled her. With a gentle sigh, Margaret stepped out of her office. "Samantha, could I see you for a moment?" Samantha's shoulders tensed, but she followed Margaret into the office with practiced composure. The door clicked shut behind them. "I noticed you were looking through Ethan Carter's loan file last night," Margaret said, keeping her voice gentle. She gestured for Samantha to take a seat. "Yes, I was." Samantha straightened in her chair. "I was just checking on the bank's risk exposure. It's part of my job to monitor potentially risky accounts." Margaret folded her hands on her desk. "Is it? I wasn't aware that was part of your current responsibilities." "Well, someone needs to look out for the bank's interests." Samantha's tone grew defensive. "With all due respect, Mrs. Hayes, approving loans based on feelings isn't exactly sound business practice. Neither is spreading gossip about clients or questioning your supervisor's judgment." Margaret's words were firm, kind. "This bank has thrived for 40 years by believing in this community. Sometimes that means looking beyond just numbers on a page. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets banks in trouble." Samantha muttered, "We're not a charity." "No, we're not." Margaret leaned forward. "But we are neighbors helping neighbors. That's what small-town banking was built on. When I started here, my mentor taught me that character is the best collateral anyone can offer." Samantha's lip curled slightly. "That's very poetic, but it won't satisfy the auditors." "Samantha," Margaret's voice softened, "why does Ethan's success bother you so much?" The question caught Samantha off guard. She blinked rapidly, her perfectly maintained facade cracking for just a moment. It doesn't. I just think rules exist for a reason." "They do, but so does mercy." Margaret smiled sadly. "Be careful with gossip, Samantha. It has a way of hurting everyone it touches." Samantha stood up, smoothing her skirt. "If you'll excuse me, I have customers waiting." She left without another word, but Margaret noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Across town, the afternoon sun warmed the playground where Ethan pushed Lila on the swings. Her delighted giggles filled the air. "Higher, Daddy! I want to touch the clouds." "Not too high, Princess," Ethan laughed. "I don't want you flying away just when things are getting better." "Are they really getting better?" Lila asked, her feet kicking at the sky. Ethan's heart swelled with hope. "They really are, sweetheart. I've got 3 more jobs lined up this week. Mrs. Johnson even recommended me to her whole church group. Does that mean we can get ice cream?" "You know what? I think we can." Ethan caught the swing gently. "Come on, let's head home. It's almost sunset." They sat together on their small front porch later, sharing a melting ice cream cone and watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. Lila had chocolate around her mouth, and Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so peaceful. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The number wasn't familiar. "Hello? Mr. Carter? This is David Mason from the Valley Tribune." The voice was friendly and professional. "I heard about your new business venture through Mrs. Johnson at First Baptist. We're doing a series on local comeback stories, and yours caught my attention." Ethan shifted in his chair. "Oh, I don't know if I'm really newspaper material." A single dad starting his own business to provide for his daughter? That's exactly the kind of inspiring story our readers love. We'd like to feature you in next week's Sunday edition, The Man Rebuilding His Dream. What do you think?" Lila looked up at him with chocolate-stained curiosity. Ethan thought about how far they'd come, about Margaret's faith in him, about all the neighbors who'd welcomed his services with open arms. "You know what? Yes, I'd be honored." After he hung up, Lila snuggled against his side. "Are you going to be famous, Daddy?" Ethan chuckled. "Not famous, sweetie. Just blessed." Meanwhile, in her apartment across town, Samantha sat at her desktop computer, scrolling through her emails. Her mouse hovered over one from corporate headquarters, subject line, "Notice of Branch Audit, March 2024. Her lips curved into a smile as she read the details. Next month, a team would conduct a thorough review of all loans approved in the past quarter. They would examine every document, every signature, every risk assessment. Samantha's eyes gleamed in the blue light of her screen. Finally, a chance to prove she'd been right all along. She clicked the email close with satisfaction. already planning how to present her concerns about certain recent approvals to the auditors. The sun had fully set now, leaving her alone in the darkness with her thoughts and her ambition. The late morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Ethan's workshop, catching motes of sawdust that danced in the air. The space wasn't much Proka, just a rented garage with concrete floors and metal walls, but to Ethan and Lila, it was their piece of heaven. "Hold the brush steady, sweetie." Ethan guided Lila's small hand as they painted an old toolbox together. The metal container had seen better days, but with each careful stroke of bright, red paint, it was coming back to life. The newspaper photographer, a friendly man named Dave, circled around them with his camera. Click, click, click. He captured Lila's tongue poking out in concentration, Ethan's gentle smile as he watched her work, their matching paint-splattered aprons. "That's perfect," Dave said, lowering his camera. "The way you two work together, it tells the whole story right there." Lila beamed up at him. "Daddy's teaching me everything. Soon I'll be fixing stuff too." Ethan ruffled her hair, careful to avoid the paint on his hands. "That's right, sweetheart. Carter and Carter Home Repairs. Maybe that'll be our name one day." The reporter, Sarah, sat on a nearby workbench, scribbling in her notebook. "Ethan, tell me more about what made you decide to start this business." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, considering his words carefully. "Well, after the factory closed, I knew I had to do something. Lila deserves a stable life, you know, and I've always been good with my hands." He gestured around the workshop. "Every broken thing has potential. It just needs someone to believe in it enough to put in the work." Sarah's pen moved quickly across the page. "And the bank? I heard they took quite a chance on you." "Mrs. Hayes did," Ethan said softly. "She saw something in me when others didn't. Sometimes that's all a person needs. Just one person willing to take a chance." At the Midland Savings Bank, the morning rush was in full swing. Margaret sat at her desk, reviewing reports, when she heard the excited chatter from the break room. Her curiosity drew her to investigate. Several employees huddled around Tommy from accounting, who held up the local newspaper. "Look at this spread," he said. They gave him 2 whole pages. The article's headline stood out in bold print. "Single Dad Rebuilds Hope, One Nail at a Time." Below it, a large photo showed Ethan teaching Lila how to use a level, both of them laughing. Mrs. Hayes, someone, spotted her in the doorway. "Your miracle loan is famous now." Margaret waved off the praise, but couldn't hide her smile. "Ethan did all the work himself. I just opened a door." "Still," Tommy insisted, "not many would have taken that risk." The article mentions you by name, calls you the banker with a heart of gold. From her desk across the room, Samantha watched the scene unfold, her jaw clenched tight. She stabbed at her keyboard with unnecessary force, trying to focus on her work instead of the constant praise being heaped on Margaret's decision. "Did you see this part?" Another teller read aloud. "In just 3 weeks, Carter's Home Repairs has completed over 30 jobs, with a growing wait list of satisfied customers." Samantha's pencil snapped in her grip. Throughout the day, customers came in clutching copies of the newspaper, asking to speak with Margaret. Many were elderly residents who'd had work done by Ethan, eager to share their stories. "He fixed my screen door for half what others quoted." One woman gushed. "Such a polite young man," another added. "And that little girl of his, sweet as pie." By closing time, Margaret's desk housed 3 bouquets sent by community members, thanking her for helping Ethan get his start. She touched the petals gently, remembering her late husband's favorite saying, "Faith without works is dead." The evening found Margaret sliding into a wooden pew at First Presbyterian, the familiar smell of old hymnals and furniture polish wrapping around her like a comfort blanket. Wednesday service was smaller than Sundays, more intimate. Pastor Jim Reynolds stood at the pulpit, his white hair catching the soft chandelier light. "Tonight," he began, "I want to talk about faith in action." His kind eyes seemed to find Margaret's. "It's easy to say we believe in something. It's harder to put those beliefs on the line, but that's exactly what God calls us to do." Margaret's hand found her necklace, the cross her husband had, given her 30 years ago. She thought of Ethan's earnest face in her office that first day, of Lila's bright eyes in the newspaper photos, of all the lives being touched by one simple act of faith. Pastor Jim continued, "Sometimes being Christ-like means taking risks the world calls foolish. It means seeing potential where others see problems. It means—" Margaret smiled, her heart full. She was living it all right. And somehow, she knew this was just the beginning. Around her, the congregation nodded along to Pastor Jim's words, but Margaret was lost in grateful prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for using me," she thought. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the biggest miracles start with the smallest acts of faith." As the sun set outside the church windows, casting warm colors through the stained glass, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. The path ahead might not be easy. She knew there would be challenges, but tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was called to do. The morning sun painted Main Street in soft golden hues as people bustled about their daily routines, coffee cups steaming in the crisp air. Outside Carter's Home Repair's newly rented workshop, a modest space wedged between Mabel's Diner and Peterson's Hardware, a line of 3 customers waited patiently on the narrow sidewalk. The scent of fresh sawdust and machine oil drifted from the open doorway, mixing with the aroma of bacon from the diner next door. Mrs. Peterson, a stout woman in her 70s, clutched a broken toaster against her wool coat while chatting animatedly with Mr. Thompson about his persistently leaky kitchen faucet. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who'd known every face in town for decades. Meanwhile, young Jenny from the corner bookstore shifted her weight nervously, holding a wobbly wooden shelf that threatened to spill its burden of repair brackets and loose screws with every movement. Inside the workshop, Ethan wiped beads of sweat from his weathered brow as he finished delicately repairing an antique radio that had been silent for 20 years. His calloused hands, scarred from factory work and roughened by honest labor, moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that some things, once broken, could never be replaced. The radio's innards lay exposed like a patient on an operating table, each wire and tube receiving his focused attention. With a final adjustment to a corroded connection, the radio suddenly crackled to life. Static gave way to the smooth brass notes of an old jazz standard, the melody filling the small workshop with warmth. Ethan's tired face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and reminded him why he'd chosen this path. His customer, elderly Mr. Wilson, clapped his gnarled hands with pure delight, his face lighting up like a child's on Christmas morning. "You're a miracle worker, Carter," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he reached for his worn leather wallet. "My late wife used to listen to her programs on this very radio. I thought I'd never hear it sing again. How much do I owe you?" Ethan's chest tightened at the gratitude in the old man's voice. $20 for the new tubes and parts, $10 for labor, he replied, his tone warm but firm. He'd learned through trial and error to value his work fairly without overcharging neighbors who were often struggling just as much as he was. The brass bell above the door chimed melodically as Mrs. Peterson shuffled inside, her orthopedic shoes squeaking slightly on the concrete floor. "The whole town's talking about you, Ethan," she announced, carefully setting her ancient toaster on his cluttered workbench. "Such honest work, such fair prices. Lord knows we needed someone like you around here, especially after Henderson's repair closed down last spring." Ethan ducked his head instinctively, his cheeks flushing slightly. He was still unused to praise after years of feeling invisible. "Just trying my best, ma'am, doing what I can to help folks out." The warmth in his voice was genuine, but underneath lay the constant worry that gnawed at him, the fear that this fragile success could crumble as quickly as it had been built. Meanwhile, across town at Midland Savings Bank, the atmosphere was considerably less cheerful. The building's sterile fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across polished marble floors and gleaming brass fixtures. Samantha Price sat rigidly at her pristine desk, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her keyboard in a steady, determined rhythm as she typed up her formal report. Each keystroke seemed to punctuate her growing sense of vindication. Her computer screen glowed with the damning subject line, "Concerning irregular loan approval, Carter, Ethan, policy violations documented." The cursor blinked expectantly, waiting for her to complete what she'd convinced herself was a necessary evil. The morning light streaming through the bank's tall windows caught her flawlessly arranged workspace, highlighting a neat stack of documents she'd spent weeks gathering. Bank policies printed on crisp white paper, highlighted in aggressive yellow strokes, risk assessment guidelines marked with red ink like wounds. Ethan's original loan application, now annotated with detailed notes in the margins that painted a picture of negligence and poor judgment. Margaret Hayes approached from the direction of the coffee station, her sensible heels clicking purposefully against the polished floor. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd weathered many storms in her 62 years. Pausing beside Samantha's desk, she noticed the younger woman's intense focus, the way her jaw was set with determination. "Everything all right, Samantha?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the genuine concern of someone who truly cared about her employees' well-being. "Just ensuring our procedures are being followed properly," Samantha replied, her tone professionally crisp and carefully modulated. She quickly minimized her screen, but not before Margaret caught a clear glimpse of Ethan's name in bold letters across the top of the document. Margaret's face remained carefully neutral, a skill perfected through decades of banking diplomacy, but her knuckles whitened slightly as her grip tightened on her ceramic coffee cup, a small tell that revealed her growing unease. She'd been in banking long enough to recognize the subtle signs of trouble brewing, like storm clouds gathering on a seemingly peaceful horizon. Back in the sanctuary of her corner office, Margaret settled behind her desk and opened her email with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing a bank branch for over 15 years. There it was, sitting like a time bomb in her inbox, a message from corporate headquarters marked high priority with the stark subject line, "Immediate audit of recent loan approvals, compliance review." Her heart sank into her stomach, but her face remained serene. Years of experience had taught her to weather professional storms with grace, even when she felt like she was drowning inside. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She reached for her personal phone, fingers hesitating over the keys as she composed a text to Ethan. They'd established a comfortable routine of occasional coffee meetings to discuss his business progress, moments that had become highlights in her otherwise routine weeks. Her fingers hovered uncertainly before typing. "Need to reschedule our coffee meet. Something came up at work. Rain check?" The message felt inadequate, failing to convey the storm that was brewing around them both. Ethan was in the middle of patiently showing Ginny the proper technique for mounting her bookstore shelf, demonstrating how to find the wall studs and explaining the importance of using the right anchors when his phone buzzed. Against his hip, reading Margaret's message, he felt a cold finger of worry trace down his spine. Margaret had never canceled their meetings before. In fact, she'd been one of his strongest supporters from the very beginning, always ready with encouragement, practical advice, and the kind of faith in his abilities that he was still learning to have in himself. "Everything okay?" Ginny asked, her young face creased with concern as she noticed the frown lines deepening around his eyes. "Yeah, just a changed appointment," he said, forcing what he hoped was a reassuring smile while his mind raced through possibilities. But something deep in his gut, the same instinct that had warned him about layoffs at the factory, told him this was anything but routine. The day wore on with agonizing normalcy. At the bank, Samantha meticulously compiled her report with the dedication of a prosecutor building a case. She included everything she could think of: the technical violations of standard approval protocols, the risk factors Margaret had supposedly overlooked in her eagerness to help, even detailed accounts of customer complaints about Ethan's initial appearance at the bank and his lack of proper credentials. "It's not personal," she muttered to herself as she attached supporting documents, bank policy excerpts, and financial projections that painted Ethan's business as a risky venture doomed to fail. "It's about maintaining professional standards and protecting the bank's reputation." But the satisfied gleam in her eyes and the slight upturn of her glossy lips suggested her motivations ran much deeper than professional duty. The late afternoon sun streamed through the bank's tall windows, casting long shadows across the lobby as Margaret prepared to leave for the day. She paused at her office doorway, taking in the familiar scene of her employees packing up their workstations. Her gaze lingered on Samantha, who remained hunched over her computer, typing with the intensity of someone on a mission. "Don't stay too late," Margaret called out, her voice maintaining its characteristic kindness despite the weight of her growing concerns about what tomorrow might bring. "Just finishing up some important paperwork," Samantha replied without looking up from her screen, her fingers never pausing in their rhythmic assault on the keyboard. After the last employee had gathered their belongings and headed home to dinner and family, Samantha remained at her desk like a sentinel. The cleaning crew arrived and methodically worked their way through the building, emptying trash cans and polishing surfaces while she continued her work. The security guard made his evening rounds, nodding politely as he passed her desk. Still, she typed on, refining her arguments and strengthening her case. Finally, as the building settled into its after-hours quiet, she sat back in her ergonomic chair and reviewed her completed work one final time. The document was thorough, professional, and damning. Every paragraph built upon the last, creating an inexorable case for immediate action. With a deep breath that felt more like a sigh of victory than relief, she positioned her cursor over the send button and clicked. The report whooshed away into cyberspace, carrying with it the potential to destroy 2 lives she'd grown to resent. The empty office around her hummed with the white noise of computers and climate control, filled with the antiseptic scent of cleaning supplies and the weight of what she'd just set in motion. Within minutes, her laptop chimed with the digital equivalent of a death knell, a new email notification appearing in her inbox. Subject: Audit Confirmation. Team arrival in 3 days. Prepare all documentation. Samantha's perfectly painted red lips curved into a satisfied smirk as she slowly closed her laptop, the click echoing through the empty bank lobby like the closing of a trap that had taken weeks to set. In the silence that followed, she gathered her belongings with the careful movements of someone who believed justice had finally been served. The Saturday morning sun painted golden streaks across the Veterans Center's weathered facade. Ethan Carter stood in the parking lot, his toolbox at his feet and his worn work gloves already on his hands. The old building's roof had been leaking for months, leaving water stains on the ceiling tiles inside where veterans gathered for coffee and companionship. "You really don't have to do this for free, son," said Bob Wilson, the center's elderly caretaker, his Vietnam veteran cap sitting proudly on his silver hair. Ethan smiled and shook his head. "They've done enough for us," he said, patting Bob's shoulder. "It's the least I can do." What happened next surprised everyone. Cars began pulling into the parking lot, one after another. People stepped out carrying tools, lumber, and supplies. Mrs. Jenkins from the flower shop brought work gloves. Tom from the hardware store arrived with a truck full of shingles he donated. Even Pastor Mike showed up in old jeans and a t-shirt, ready to work. Lila bounced around the growing crowd, her pigtails swinging as she set up a card table with plastic cups and a giant pitcher of lemonade. "Daddy," she called out, "I made signs." She proudly displayed her colorful posters that read, "Free lemonade for heroes helpers." Ethan's throat tightened with emotion as he watched more volunteers arrive. He hadn't expected this, hadn't asked for help, but here they were, dozens of townspeople ready to pitch in, turning his simple act of kindness into something bigger. "All right, folks," Ethan called out, finding his voice. "We've got 3 sections of roof to repair. If we work together, we can finish before sunset." The volunteers organized themselves into teams. Some carried supplies up the ladder, others removed old shingles, and still others began repairs on the wooden underlayment. The sound of hammers and friendly chatter filled the air. Leela weaved through the crowd with her tray of lemonade, offering drinks to sweaty workers. "Thank you for helping my daddy help the veterans," she told each person, her smile bright enough to rival the morning sun. Around mid-morning, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the parking lot. Margaret Hayes stood quietly observing, her eyes misty as she watched the community come together. She wore casual clothes instead of her usual business attire, and her face showed pure pride as she watched Ethan direct the volunteer crews. A local news van pulled up, and a young reporter named Sarah Chen stepped out with her cameraman. They began filming the scene, the volunteers on the roof, Lila serving lemonade, veterans watching from lawn chairs with grateful smiles. "Mr. Carter?" Sarah called out, waving Ethan over. "Could we get a few words about what inspired this community project?" Ethan climbed down from the roof, wiping his brow. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he spoke from his heart. "These men and women served our country. They gave everything for us. Sometimes the smallest things we can do mean the most, like fixing a leaky roof so they have a dry place to meet their friends." The camera captured Lila running up to hug her father's waist. "My daddy fixes everything," she declared proudly to the reporter. "He says helping others fixes our hearts too." Throughout the day, more people joined the effort. Someone ordered pizzas for lunch. The veterans shared stories with volunteers during breaks. Young kids helped Lila with her lemonade stand. The work continued steadily, with experienced contractors guiding those who'd never held a hammer before. Margaret moved through the crowd quietly, speaking softly with veterans and volunteers alike. When she passed Ethan on one of his trips down the ladder, she simply squeezed his arm and smiled, no words necessary between them. By late afternoon, the roof was finished. The old shingles had been cleared away, new ones laid perfectly in place. Bob Wilson stood with tears in his eyes as he inspected the work. "I don't know how to thank you all," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No thanks needed," Ethan replied, looking at the crowd of tired but satisfied volunteers. "This is what community means." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, a cup of tea cooling on the side table. She turned on her TV just in time to catch the local news. There was Ethan on the screen, looking bashful but proud as he explained the project. The camera panned to show Lila's beaming face as she stood beside her father, then swept across the volunteers working together on the roof. In a time when good news can be hard to find, the reporter's voice said over the footage, one man's simple act of kindness sparked an entire community to action. Margaret watched the segment with tears in her eyes, her hands clasped together. As the story ended with a shot of Ethan and Lila smiling at each other, she whispered into the quiet of her home, "Lord, please let this good work stand strong." The TV screen changed to other news, but Margaret sat there, lost in thought, remembering the day's scenes of generosity and community spirit. She thought about the trust she'd placed in Ethan, and how he was proving worthy of it in ways that went far beyond loan payments and business plans. The Monday morning sun barely penetrated the heavy clouds hanging over Midland Savings Bank. Inside, the usual warm atmosphere had turned cold and sterile as three corporate auditors in press suits commandeered the conference room. Their matching leather briefcases and stern expressions set everyone on edge. Margaret Hayes sat straight-backed in her chair, her hands folded calmly on the polished table. But beneath her composed exterior, her heart raced as she watched the lead auditor, Mr. Davidson, flip through Ethan's loan file with disapproving clicks of his tongue. "Miss Hayes? Davidson?" he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Could you explain why you personally guaranteed this loan despite multiple red flags?" His tone carried the sharp edge of judgment. "Of course," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "Mr. Carter demonstrated exceptional character and work ethic. His business plan, while modest, showed careful planning and realistic goals." Samantha Price sat at the far end of the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping silently against her tablet. "If I may add," she interjected with practiced innocence, "it was unusual to see such special attention given to a single application." Margaret felt the subtle dig but kept her focus on Davidson. Every application deserves thorough consideration. But not every application gets the branch manager's personal guarantee, the second auditor, Miss Chen, pointed out. She spread several documents across the table. "Your own guidelines specifically warn against emotional decision-making in loan approvals." "Sometimes," Margaret said, squaring her shoulders, "the human element matters more than numbers. Mr. Carter has already proven himself with consistent payments and growing business success." "And the free work he's been doing?" Davidson questioned, eyebrows raised. "How does that demonstrate sound business judgment?" Samantha cleared her throat delicately. "He does seem to spend a lot of time on unpaid projects. Just last week, the Veterans Center." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Margaret's eyes flashed. That kind of community involvement has actually increased his paying customer base. Word of mouth is powerful in a small town. "Small towns," Davidson said dryly, "are precisely where personal relationships can cloud professional judgment." He closed the file with a snap. "Miss Hayes, your decades of service are commendable, but this decision requires review." "I stand by my assessment," Margaret declared firmly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means looking beyond spreadsheets to see potential." The third auditor, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Noble sentiments, but banks run on numbers, not sentiment." Outside the conference room, the regular bustle of the bank continued, but employees cast worried glances toward the closed door. Through the glass walls, they could see Margaret's unwavering posture as she defended her decision. Across town, Ethan was finishing up a plumbing repair when his phone buzzed. A text from his mail carrier. "Certified letter from the bank waiting at your house?" His stomach nodded. Certified mail rarely brought good news. He packed his tools quickly, trying to push down the rising anxiety. When he arrived home, Lila was already there with Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor who watched her after school. The bright yellow envelope sat ominously on the kitchen counter. "Daddy," Lila called out, running to hug him. "I got an A on my science project." Ethan hugged her back, forcing a smile. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." He nodded thanks to Mrs. Johnson as she gathered her things to leave. Once alone with Lila, Ethan stared at the envelope. His daughter sensed his tension and stood close, her small hand slipping into his. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" Ethan took a deep breath and opened the letter. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the official-looking document. "Dear Mr. Carter," he read aloud, his voice growing hoarser with each word. "This letter is to inform you that your small business loan, #257 to 859, is currently under review. All payments are temporarily suspended pending investigation." Lila squeezed his hand tighter. "What does that mean?" Ethan lowered the letter, meeting his daughter's worried eyes. He couldn't hide the shake in his hands, but he tried to keep his voice steady for her sake. "It means we might have some bumps in the road ahead, sweetie." "But your business is doing good," Lila protested. "Everyone says so. Even Mr. Wilson at the Veterans Center said you're the best handyman in town." The innocent pride in her voice made Ethan's chest ache. He pulled her close, the formal letter crumpling slightly in his grip. Through their kitchen window, he could see the used truck he'd bought with the loan money, the toolbox in its bed containing everything he'd built his fresh start upon. "Sometimes," he told Lila, echoing words Margaret had once said to him, "doing good work isn't enough. We have to be patient and keep faith." But as he held his daughter, the letter's cold bureaucratic language seemed to mock all his hopes for stability. Everything he'd worked so hard to build felt suddenly fragile, balanced on the edge of someone else's judgment. The bank's glass doors felt heavier than usual as Ethan pushed through them, his work boots leaving small traces of mud on the polished floor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lobby, and the usual buzz of customers seemed muted today. His chest tightened when he saw Samantha at her usual spot, but she quickly looked away, busying herself with paperwork. "Mr. Carter?" Margaret's familiar voice called from her office doorway. "Please, come in." Inside her office, the morning light filtered through the lace curtains, but the warmth Ethan remembered from his first visit felt diminished somehow. Margaret's desk, usually neat and organized, was covered with stacks of papers and folders. "I got the letter," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled the crumpled paper from his jacket pocket. "What does this mean for my business?" "For Lila?" Margaret gestured for him to sit down. Her eyes were tired, but her voice remained steady. "The audit team is reviewing all of my recent loan approvals. They're particularly interested in," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "cases where I may have exercised personal judgment over standard protocols. But I haven't missed a single payment," Ethan said, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm doing good work. People trust me now." "I know, Ethan." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to the cross pendant she wore. "And that's exactly why I approved your loan. I saw something in you that no spreadsheet could capture. Dedication, integrity, faith." Ethan's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I can't lose this, Margaret. Lila's finally proud of me again. She tells her friends at school that her daddy fixes things for people who need help." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bank's parking lot where Ethan's old truck sat among the newer vehicles. "I'm not giving up, Ethan. I've been at this bank for 27 years. My record speaks for itself, and I'm going to fight for you." "But what if, no what ifs?" Margaret turned back to face him, her expression determined. "Keep working. Keep helping people. Let me handle the audit team." Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Samantha sat at her desk, finishing up the day's transactions. The audit team had taken over the conference room down the hall, and their voices carried through the thin walls. "Did you see how she kept talking about faith and instinct?" One of the auditors laughed. "This isn't church, it's banking." "Hayes is probably past her prime," another added. "All that emotional decision-making. Maybe it's time for some fresh blood in management." Samantha's fingers froze over her keyboard. She glanced toward Margaret's office, where the older woman was still working, her desk lamp creating a warm glow in the growing darkness. For the first time, Samantha noticed how Margaret's shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. The laughter from the conference room continued. I mean, who approves a loan based on seeing something in someone's eyes? This isn't a Hallmark movie. Heat crept up Samantha's neck, but this time it wasn't from satisfaction. It was shame. She remembered her own mocking words to Ethan that first day, how she'd dismissed him without a second thought. She'd been so sure of herself, so convinced that her cynicism was just good business sense. Across town, Ethan worked by the light of his truck's headlamps, measuring boards for Mrs. Henderson's broken fence. The elderly woman had insisted on paying him, even though he'd offered to do it for free. "You've got a little girl to take care of," she'd said firmly, pressing the money into his hand. His fingers moved methodically, measuring twice before each cut. Lord, he whispered, his breath visible in the cool evening air, I know, you didn't bring me this far to let it all fall apart. He lined up another board. The familiar motion of hammer striking nail oddly comforting. Please help, Margaret. She risked everything to help me. The first drops of rain began to fall as Ethan gathered his tools, each one carefully cleaned and placed in its proper spot in his toolbox. He'd learned early on that taking care of his equipment meant it would take care of him. The sound of the raindrops on metal grew stronger as he closed the truck's tailgate. Above him, the sky rumbled ominously. Ethan paused, looking up at the darkening clouds. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the neighborhood, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. The morning dawned gray and cold, matching the heaviness in Margaret's heart as she packed her personal items into a cardboard box. Family photos, her favorite coffee mug, and the small cross that had hung behind her desk for 15 years, all carefully wrapped in tissue paper. The bank felt different today, colder somehow, as employees avoided eye contact while she cleaned out her office. Through the glass walls, she could see Samantha already settling into the manager's chair, arranging papers with quick, efficient movements. The younger woman's face was a mask of professional detachment, but there was a hint of discomfort in her posture. Mrs. Hayes? A security guard stood awkwardly in the doorway. I'm sorry, but I need to escort you out. Margaret nodded, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. Of course, Thomas. Just give me one more moment. She placed the potted plant Ethan had given her carefully on top of the box. As she walked through the lobby, several longtime customers stopped and stared. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been banking here for 30 years, reached out to squeeze her hand. This isn't right, Margaret. We all know it. Everything happens for a reason, Margaret replied softly, though her voice wavered slightly. Across town, Ethan stood in his empty storage unit, staring at the bare shelves where his tools had been. The repossession team had been thorough, taking everything from his power drills to the toolbox he and Lila had painted together. The only things left were a few personal items they couldn't legally take, photos of his late wife, Lila's drawings taped to the wall, and the newspaper article that had once seemed like such a blessing. His phone buzzed with another canceled job. That made 5 today. Word spread fast in small towns, and not always kindly. The same people who'd praised his work now wondered aloud if there had been something suspicious about his loan after all. Walking home, Ethan passed the Veterans Center where he'd fixed the roof just days ago. Old Mr. Jenkins, the center's director, was outside sweeping the steps. When he saw Ethan, he quickly turned away, pretending to be absorbed in his task. The rejection stung, but nothing prepared him for what waited at home. Lila sat at their small kitchen table, her math homework untouched in front of her. Her usually bright eyes were clouded with worry, and she'd been biting her lower lip, something she only did when deeply troubled. Tommy's dad at school said, "We're in trouble," she said without preamble. He said the bank is taking everything because... She hesitated, her young face scrunched in confusion. Because we cheated? Daddy, did we do something wrong? The question hit Ethan like a physical blow. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and knelt beside her chair, pulling her into a tight hug. She smelled of strawberry shampoo and grape juice. Such innocent smells for such a heavy conversation. No, sweetheart, he said firmly, holding her close. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups get things mixed up, and they need time to figure out the truth. It's just a misunderstanding. Lila pulled back slightly, studying his face with those eerily perceptive eyes she'd inherited from her mother. But why did they take your tools? How will you help people fix things? Ethan swallowed hard. It's temporary, honey. Like when the library holds onto a book until you bring back the one you borrowed. They're just holding on to things until they sort everything out. But we didn't borrow the tools, Lila protested. You bought them with the money the nice lady at the bank gave you. Mrs. Hayes, Ethan corrected gently. And yes, that's true. But sometimes things get complicated in ways that are hard to explain. Lila's lower lip trembled. Is Mrs. Hayes in trouble because of us? No, sweetie. Mrs. Hayes is in trouble because she chose to be kind. And some people don't understand that kindness is more important than rules sometimes. He helped her with her homework, made her favorite mac and cheese for dinner, and tried to keep things as normal as possible. They watched her favorite cartoon, and he read her usual bedtime story, doing all the silly voices that usually made her giggle. Tonight, though, her laughter seemed forced. After she finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan remained beside her bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. In the soft glow of her nightlight, she looked so small, so vulnerable. The weight of everything, the lost equipment, the canceled jobs, the whispers and turned backs, seemed to crash down on him at once. Kneeling beside her bed, he clasped his hands. Together, bowing his head. The prayer came wordlessly at first, more a desperate plea than formed thoughts. "Please, God," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room, "don't let this break her heart." A tear rolled down his cheek as he watched his daughter sleep, her small hand clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. She'd already lost so much in her young life. Her mother, their old house, the security of knowing where their next meal would come from. And now this dream, too, seemed to be slipping away. Lila stirred slightly in her sleep, mumbling something about tools with wings, and Ethan gently tucked her blanket more securely around her shoulders. No matter what happened, he would protect her from the harsh realities as much as he could. She deserved to keep believing in goodness, in the power of kindness, in the possibility of dreams coming true. Samantha tossed and turned in her bed, the digital clock on her nightstand mockingly displaying 3:17 a.m. in harsh red numbers. Her silk pajamas felt suffocating, and she kicked off her covers for the 10th time that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Margaret's face, not angry or accusatory, but filled with that same gentle understanding that had always irritated her before. The moonlight filtered through her apartment's blinds, casting striped shadows across her bedroom wall. She sat up, running her fingers through her disheveled hair. The promotion to acting manager should have felt like a victory. Instead, it sat in her stomach like a stone. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, padding to her kitchen for a glass of water. Her perfectly organized apartment, usually a source of pride, felt sterile and empty. As she stood at her sink, she caught her reflection in the window, dark circles under her eyes, her usually impeccable appearance nowhere to be found. The morning came too quickly. Samantha called in sick to work for the first time in her career, her voice shaking as she spoke to the assistant manager. After a shower that didn't wash away her guilt, she found herself driving through familiar countryside roads, following directions to Margaret's address she'd seen in the personnel files. Margaret's farmhouse sat back from the road, its white paint weathered but well-maintained. A wooden swing hung from a massive oak tree in the front yard, and cheerful yellow curtains peeked through the windows. It was exactly the kind of home Samantha would have sneered at a week ago. Modest, old-fashioned, probably full of tacky decorations. Her hands trembled as she parked her BMW in the gravel driveway. Before she could lose her nerve, she forced herself to walk to the front door and knock. "Coming!" Margaret's voice called from inside. The door opened, and there stood her former boss, wearing a floral apron over simple clothes, her silver hair in its usual neat bun. "Samantha? What a surprise!" "Come in, dear." The genuine warmth in Margaret's voice made Samantha's throat tighten. She followed Margaret into a cozy kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Sunlight streamed through those yellow curtains, highlighting the worn but clean wooden table where Margaret gestured for her to sit. "I just took some banana bread out of the oven," Margaret said, busying herself with a teapot. "And I always make too much tea for just myself. Would you like some?" Samantha nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched as Margaret moved efficiently around her kitchen, setting out delicate teacups that probably belonged to her grandmother, cutting thick slices of banana bread, arranging everything just so on a tray. "Sugar? Milk?" Margaret asked, pouring steaming tea into the cups. "Black is fine," Samantha managed to say. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped nervously against the wooden table. Margaret settled into the chair across from her, that same patient smile on her face that Samantha had seen countless times at the bank. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the distant song of birds outside. Ahead, Samantha started, then stopped. She took a sip of tea to steady herself. "I did something terrible, Margaret." Margaret's blue eyes held no surprise, only compassion. "Go on," she said softly. "I was jealous," Samantha burst out, the words tumbling over each other, "of how everyone respected you, how you could break the rules and still be right. I hated that you saw something in Ethan that I missed. I wanted to prove you wrong." She stared down at her teacup, unable to meet Margaret's gaze. "I reported the loan irregularities to corporate. I made it sound worse than it was. I wanted your job, but not like this. Not by destroying people's lives." A tear splashed onto the wooden table, and Samantha realized she was crying. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried in front of anyone. Margaret reached across the table and covered Samantha's hand with her own. Her skin was soft and warm, her touch gentle. "Oh, my dear," she said, and there were tears in her eyes too. "We all make mistakes. The question is what we do to fix them. How can I fix this?" Samantha asked, her voice breaking. "I've ruined everything. Your career, Ethan's business, his daughter's future. It's never too late to make it right," Margaret said softly, squeezing Samantha's hand. "The truth has a way of healing things, if we're brave enough to speak it." Samantha looked around the kitchen, taking in the fresh flowers in a mason jar, the hand-stitched pot holders, the Bible on the windowsill. Everything about this place spoke of love, of care, of a life well lived. She thought of her own empty apartment, of all the relationships she'd sacrificed in her climb to the top. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes with a napkin. Margaret quietly passed her. "I've been so wrong about everything." "We all lose our way sometimes," Margaret said, pouring more tea into Samantha's cup. "What matters is finding our way back." They sat together in the warm kitchen, sharing tea and banana bread as Samantha's tears gradually subsided. The morning light grew stronger, casting a golden glow over everything, and somewhere in that gentle light, Samantha found her courage. Rising from the table, she smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. "I need to go to the bank," she said. "I need to tell the auditors everything." Margaret stood and hugged her, the first real hug Samantha had received in years. As she walked to her car, wiping the last tears from her eyes, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The morning sun streamed through the bank's windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Samantha Price stood in the doorway, her normally confident posture replaced by visible tension. Her hands clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and she could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. The main lobby buzzed with the usual morning activity, customers making deposits, tellers counting money, phones ringing in the background. But in the conference room, visible through glass walls, 3 corporate auditors sat hunched over stacks of papers and open laptops. Samantha took small, careful steps toward the conference room. Each click of her heels against the floor felt deafening. She had barely slept last night, Margaret's gentle words echoing in her mind. It's never too late to make it right. As she approached the glass door, one of the auditors, Mr. Jenkins, a stern man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up and nodded for her to enter. The other bank employees watched curiously as she stepped inside. "Miss Price, Mr." Jenkins said, shuffling some papers. "We were just reviewing the documentation you provided about Mr. Carter's loan approval." Samantha's throat felt dry. She remained standing, though an empty chair waited nearby. "Actually," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that's what I need to talk to you about." The female auditor, Mrs. Chen, paused her typing and looked up. The third auditor set down his coffee cup. "No more stuff." Samantha's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and started again, louder this time. "I need to confess something." Through the glass walls, she could see other employees stopping to watch. A small crowd was gathering, drawn by the unusual sight of their typically composed colleague looking so distressed. "The investigation into Margaret Hayes' loan approval, I initiated it," Samantha said, her words tumbling out faster now, "but not because of any real concerns about bank policy. I did it because I was proud and prejudiced." The room fell silent. Mr. Jenkins's eyebrows rose above his glasses. "When Mr. Carter first came in seeking a loan, I treated him terribly," Samantha continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I laughed at him in front of other customers. I judged him by his worn jacket and his simple dreams. I was cruel, and when Margaret approved his loan anyway, I couldn't stand being proved wrong." She wiped at her eyes, smearing her carefully applied mascara. "I started digging through his file, looking for problems. I made subtle comments to undermine trust in Margaret's judgment. I wanted to prove she'd made a mistake, not because I cared about the bank's interests, but because I couldn't admit that I had been wrong about him." Through the glass, she could see more people gathering. The bank's regular business had nearly ground to a halt as employees and customers alike watched the scene unfolding in the conference room. "Margaret Hayes is an excellent manager who saw something I was too blind to see," Samantha said, her voice growing stronger. She saw a good man trying to build a better life for his daughter. She saw character where I only saw class. She understood that sometimes humanity matters more than numbers on a page. Mrs. Chin exchanged glances with her fellow auditors. Mr. Jenkins removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. "I'm begging you to forgive my actions," Samantha continued, now addressing everyone in and outside the conference room. "Margaret doesn't deserve to lose her position. Mr. Carter doesn't deserve to lose his business. They're both good people who did nothing wrong. I'm the one who acted improperly, and I'll accept whatever consequences come from my confession." The silence that followed felt endless. Samantha could hear her own heartbeat, could feel dozens of eyes staring at her. Some faces showed shock, others disappointment, and a few, to her surprise, showed something like respect. Mr. Jenkins finally broke the silence. "This is highly irregular, Miss Price." He glanced at his fellow auditors. "We'll need to document this statement and revise our findings accordingly." "I understand," Samantha said quietly. "I've prepared a written statement as well." She reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out several typed pages. "It details everything I've just said, plus the specific ways I attempted to influence this investigation. I'm ready to sign it in front of witnesses." As she placed the papers on the conference table, a soft murmur rose from the crowd outside. Through the glass, she could see people whispering to each other, some already pulling out phones. The news spread through the small town's grapevine at lightning speed. At Carter's Home Repairs, Ethan was replacing a kitchen faucet when his customer, Mrs. Thompson, burst into the room with her phone in hand. "Ethan, you won't believe what just happened at the bank," Mrs. Thompson exclaimed, nearly dropping her coffee cup in excitement. "That young teller, the one who was so rude to you, she just confessed to everything. Said she started all this trouble because she was too proud to admit she was wrong about you." Ethan straightened up from under the sink, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He wiped his hands on a rag, trying to process what he was hearing. "Samantha Price?" he asked, remembering all too well the sting of her mockery that first day. "She confessed?" Mrs. Thompson nodded eagerly. "Right in front of everyone. Said Margaret Hayes was right about you all along, and that she, Samantha, was the one who'd done wrong. Can you believe it?" Ethan leaned against the counter, stunned. After everything that had happened, the equipment, seizure, the suspended loan, the whispers around town, this was the last thing he'd expected. The possibility that things might turn around, that his dream might not be over after all, seemed almost too much to hope for. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the windows of Pete's Diner as regular customers huddled around tables, their coffee growing cold. Mary Thompson, the elderly widow whose porch Ethan had fixed for free, tapped her pen against a piece of paper. "We can't just sit here and let this happen," she declared, her weathered hands smoothing out the letter she'd been writing. "That young man gave me back my independence when he fixed my porch. Wouldn't take a dime for it either." Around her, heads nodded in agreement. Tom Weber, the hardware store owner, pulled out his phone, already posted about it on the community Facebook page. "You wouldn't believe how many people are sharing their stories about Ethan's work." At another table, Sarah Chin, whose leaky roof Ethan had repaired during last month's storms, typed furiously on her laptop. "I'm writing to the bank's regional office. Margaret Hayes saw something in Ethan that went beyond numbers on a page. That's exactly the kind of person we need making decisions in this town." The bell above the diner's door chimed as Commander Jack Phillips from the Veterans Center walked in, his face set with determination. The conversations hushed as he cleared his throat. "Just got off the phone with the center's board," he announced. "We're calling an emergency community meeting. Tonight at 7. That roof repair Ethan did for us saved us thousands of dollars we didn't have. It's our turn to step up for him." The diner buzzed with renewed energy. Betty, the waitress, started passing out blank papers to anyone who wanted to write a letter of support. Outside, people were stopping on the sidewalk to read the hastily made signs in the diner's window. "Community meeting tonight. Support Ethan Carter and Margaret Hayes." At the Veterans Center, volunteers arranged folding chairs in neat rows. The old building, with its fresh repairs still visible on the roof, seemed to stand a little prouder. Commander Phillips set up a table near the entrance with a petition already bearing dozens of signatures. "Margaret Hayes believed in second chances," he muttered as he straightened the papers. "Well, this town believes in them too." By 6:30, cars filled the parking lot. Inside, the wooden floors creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. Mrs. Thompson sat in the front row, clutching her letter. Tom Weber helped set up a projector to display some of the social media posts, pictures of Ethan working, stories of his kindness, memories of Margaret's quiet wisdom at the bank. Lila held her father's hand as they walked toward the building. She wore her best dress, the one she usually saved for church. Ethan had combed his hair neatly and put on his only tie, though his hand shook slightly as he adjusted it. "Look, Daddy," Lila whispered, pointing at the crowd gathering outside the entrance. "All these people came for us?" Ethan squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As they approached, Commander Phillips stepped forward to greet them. "Ethan," he said warmly, "we've got something to show you." Inside, the meeting room was packed. People stood along the walls, their faces familiar from countless repair jobs and friendly conversations. Mrs. Thompson waved from her seat, and Tom Weber gave him a thumbs up from near the projector. Commander Phillips guided them to 2 chairs reserved in the front row. On the screen above, images cycled through: Ethan fixing Mrs. Thompson's porch, working on the Veterans Center roof, teaching local kids basic tool safety at the summer fair. "Friends," Commander Phillips addressed the room, his voice carrying to the back, "we're here tonight because 2 people in our community need our help. Margaret Hayes saw potential where others saw risk. Ethan Carter proved her right with every nail he hammered and every roof he fixed." The crowd murmured in agreement. He held up a thick stack of papers. "We have here over 200 signatures demanding the bank reinstate Margaret Hayes and restore Ethan's loan. But more than that, we have stories. Mrs. Thompson, would you like to start?" The elderly widow stood slowly, unfolding her letter with careful hands. "When my porch was falling apart, I couldn't even get my mail without fear of falling. Contractors wanted thousands I didn't have. Then Ethan showed up one morning with his tools and a smile. He worked through his lunch break to fix it, and when I tried to pay him, he just said, 'Your chocolate chip cookies are payment enough.'" More stories followed. The young couple whose nursery Ethan had childproofed at cost. The school janitor whose broken water heater Ethan replaced on a Sunday evening. Each tale drew nods and voices of support. Sarah Chin stood up, her laptop open. "I've been collecting these stories online. Over 50 people have written in just today. The bank needs to see that their numbers can't measure the impact of kindness and hard work." Commander Phillips raised his voice over the growing excitement. "We're sending these letters and signatures to the bank's regional office tonight. But more than that, we're showing them what community really means." Lila tugged on her father's sleeve. "See, Daddy, they all know you're a good person, just like Miss Margaret said." Ethan looked down at his daughter, then around at the room full of familiar faces. These were more than customers. They were neighbors who'd become friends, people who'd trusted him with their homes, who'd recommended him to others, who'd believed in him just as Margaret had. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause, some standing, others calling out words of encouragement. Commander Phillips raised his hands for quiet. "This isn't just about business," he declared. "It's about doing what's right." Margaret Hayes saw the heart of a good man trying to build a better life for his daughter. We've all seen that heart in action, and we're not going to let it be broken by cold corporate policies. More cheers filled the room. Ethan felt Lila's small hand slip into his, and for the first time since receiving that formal letter, his smile came easily. The warmth of community support wrapped around them like a protective blanket, and in that moment, surrounded by friends and neighbors, hope flickered back to life in his heart. The applause grew louder, echoing off the newly repaired roof above them. Ethan stood, Lila beside him, as their community rose to its feet in a standing ovation, not for what he'd lost, but for what they would help him rebuild. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of Midland Savings Bank. Harold Bennett, the regional director, stepped out, adjusting his tie. At 65, with silver hair and kind wrinkles around his eyes, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen every kind of banking crisis imaginable. Inside the bank, employees straightened their desks and whispered nervously. Samantha Price stood near her counter, hands clasped tightly together. The weight of her recent confession still hung heavy in the air. "Good morning," Bennett said, his voice warm but professional. "I understand we have quite a situation to untangle here." The bank staff watched as he made his way to Margaret's empty office. He spent an hour reviewing files, occasionally glancing out the window at the town square where Ethan's truck used to park each morning. Around 10 o'clock, Bennett emerged and asked, Could someone direct me to the Veterans Center? I'd like to see this roof everyone's talking about. The drive to the Veterans Center took only 5 minutes. As Bennett's car pulled into the parking lot, he noticed the fresh paint and neat flower beds along the walkway. The roof, Ethan's last major project before the equipment seizure, stood out with its even lines and careful craftsmanship. Inside, the center hummed with activity. A dozen veterans gathered for their morning coffee club, and the sound of friendly conversation filled the air. Commander Roberts, a retired Marine with a silver crew cut, approached Bennett with an outstretched hand. "We've been expecting you, sir," Roberts said, "hoping you might want to hear our side of things." Bennett nodded, taking in the clean, well-maintained space. "I'm all ears, Commander." For the next hour, veteran after veteran stepped forward to share stories about Ethan Carter. They spoke of his careful work, his fair prices, and most importantly, his character. A World War II veteran named Frank, leaning on his cane, described how Ethan had fixed his porch steps for free when he couldn't afford the repair. "That young man," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion, "he reminded me of the boys I served with. Quiet strength, does what needs doing without making a fuss." Bennett listened intently, taking notes in a small leather notebook. He asked thoughtful questions about timing, quality, and follow-through, but mostly, he just listened. Around noon, several townspeople arrived, having heard the regional director was visiting. Sarah from the diner brought coffee and sandwiches. The mayor's wife stopped by with photo albums showing the center before and after Ethan's work. Each person had a story to tell about, either Ethan's work ethic or Margaret's wisdom in giving him a chance. "Would you like to see some of his other projects?" Commander Roberts asked. Bennett checked his watch and nodded. "Show me everything." They drove through town in Bennett's sedan, stopping at various homes and businesses where Ethan had worked. At each stop, owners came out to praise the quality of his repairs. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow, showed them her restored front porch where Ethan had replaced rotting boards and built a sturdy handrail. "That man," she said, patting the railing, "he didn't just fix my porch, he gave me back my independence." Their final stop was Ethan's workshop, now locked and empty since the equipment seizure. Through the windows, they could see the neat organization systems he'd built, the carefully labeled storage bins, and a child-sized workbench where Lila used to help sort nails. Bennett stood for a long moment, hands in his pockets, studying the space. A Carter's Home Repairs sign hung slightly crooked on the wall, its fresh paint now gathering dust. "Tell me about Margaret Hayes," Bennett said suddenly, turning to Commander Roberts. "Best thing that ever happened to this bank," Roberts replied without hesitation. "She sees people, not just numbers." "When my wife passed, Margaret helped me sort out all the paperwork. Spent hours after closing time getting everything in order." Bennett nodded, making another note in his book. They drove back to the Veterans Center, where more townspeople had gathered. Someone had set up a display of before and after photos showing Ethan's work around town. Looking at the transformation of the center's roof, Bennett ran his hand along the new guttering. "Quality work," he murmured. "Attention to detail." He turned to face the gathered crowd, his expression thoughtful. "In 30 years of banking, I've learned that numbers tell an important story," he began. "But they don't tell the whole story. Sometimes," he paused, looking around at the earnest faces before him, "sometimes faith is just good business." A hopeful murmur ran through the crowd. Bennett carefully closed his notebook and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I'll be reviewing this case personally tonight," he announced, "every aspect of it." The gathered townspeople watched as he walked back to his car, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression unreadable but not unkind. Through the center's windows, they could see him making one final note before starting his engine. Margaret sat at her kitchen table early that morning, sunlight streaming through her lace curtains as she sipped her morning tea. Her Bible lay open beside her, its pages worn from years of daily readings. The past few weeks had tested her faith, but she'd found comfort in her morning ritual of prayer and reflection. The sharp ring of her phone made her jump slightly. She reached for it, her heart quickening as she recognized the bank's main office number. "Hello, this is Margaret Hayes," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Margaret, this is Richard Thompson, Regional Director," came the warm voice she recognized from yesterday's visit. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, sir. I'm an early riser." "Good, good." There was a pause, and Margaret held her breath. "Well, I won't keep you in suspense. I spent most of last night reviewing everything. The loan documents, the community letters, the business performance metrics, and of course, Miss Price's statement. Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup. Margaret, I want you to know that effective immediately, your suspension is lifted. Furthermore, your original decision regarding Mr. Carter's loan is fully reinstated. The teacup clinked against its saucer as Margaret's hand trembled. Tears welled in her eyes as relief flooded through her. Thank you, sir, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. No, Margaret, thank you. In fact, I've just sent out a company-wide memo using this situation as a case study in values-based leadership. Your instinct to look beyond the numbers and see the human potential? That's exactly what banking should be about. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. I just did what I felt was right, sir. And that's precisely why we need more leaders like you. I'd like you to help develop a training program based on this experience. Would you be willing? Of course, Margaret replied, thinking of all the other Ethans out there who just needed someone to believe in them. After ending the call, Margaret stood by her window, watching the morning light paint the sky in brilliant pinks and golds. Thank you, Lord, she whispered, tears of gratitude rolling down her cheeks. Thank you for showing me the way. Within an hour, the news had spread through the small town like wildfire. As Margaret drove to the bank, she noticed people waving and smiling at her from the sidewalks. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop even ran out to give her a quick hug. The bank lobby fell silent when she walked in, then erupted in applause. Her staff gathered around, offering congratulations and welcome back hugs. Even Samantha approached, her eyes downcast but sincere. Mrs. Hayes, Samantha said quietly, I'm so sorry for everything. Margaret took the young woman's hands in hers. We all make mistakes, dear. It's what we learn from them that matters. Throughout the day, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. She'd heard his equipment had been returned yesterday afternoon, and he'd immediately gotten back to work. As the sun began to set, she decided to pay him a visit. She found his workshop, a converted garage space he rented on the edge of town, humming with activity. The door was rolled up, revealing Ethan organizing his tools while Lila sat at a small desk, doing her homework under the warm glow of a lamp. When Ethan looked up and saw her standing there, he immediately set down the wrench he was holding. Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice full of emotion. I hope I'm not interrupting, Margaret said, stepping into the workshop. Lila jumped up from her desk. Mrs. Hayes, she exclaimed, running over to give her a hug. Daddy said you helped save his business. Margaret hugged the little girl back, then looked at Ethan. Your daddy saved his own business, sweetheart. He just needed someone to give him a chance. Ethan walked over, shaking his head. You did so much more than that. His voice cracked slightly. You believed in me when nobody else would. You risked your career for a stranger. Not a stranger, Margaret corrected gently. I saw a good man trying his best to build a better life for his daughter. That's someone worth believing in. They looked at each other for a moment, understanding passing between them. Then Ethan stepped forward and wrapped Margaret in a tight hug. She hugged him back, feeling the same kind of pride she imagined she would have felt if he'd been her own son. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, for everything. They stayed like that for a long moment while Lila watched with a bright smile. The setting sun painted the workshop in warm, golden light, and through the open door, Margaret could hear birds singing their evening songs. In that moment, she felt God's presence more strongly than ever, reminding her that sometimes the greatest acts of faith were simply believing in the goodness of others. The late March sun painted long shadows across Margaret's office as she sat with Samantha, reviewing customer service protocols. But this wasn't their usual training session. Margaret held a worn photo in her hands, her late husband standing in front of his first classroom 30 years ago. You see, Sam, Margaret said softly. Using the nickname that had gradually replaced the formal Miss Price, Tommy always said teaching was about seeing the person behind the problem. She smiled at the memory, just like banking should be about seeing the story behind the numbers. Samantha nodded, her usually perfect posture relaxed as she leaned forward in her chair. The past few weeks had transformed her. The sharp edges of her ambition had softened into something more meaningful. I keep thinking about how I treated Ethan that first day, Samantha admitted, absently straightening her nameplate that now read Assistant Branch Manager in training. I saw his worn jacket and immediately made assumptions. Margaret placed the photo back on her desk. That's exactly why you're going to be an excellent leader someday. You learned from your mistake, and more importantly, you had the courage to make it right. Outside the office window, they watched as Ethan's truck pulled up to the bank. His company logo, Carter's Home Repairs, Building Trust one job at a time, gleamed in fresh paint on the door. Two other trucks now bore the same emblem. Speaking of making things right, Margaret said with a knowing smile, "I believe someone has a loan payment to make." Samantha rose, smoothing her skirt. "I'll handle it personally, if that's okay." "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." At the counter, Ethan approached with an envelope and a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. His work boots were still dusty, but his stance was straight, proud without being boastful. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," Samantha greeted him warmly. "How's business?" "Please, it's just Ethan," he replied with an easy smile. "And business is, well, it's a blessing." He slid the envelope across the counter. "Monthly payment, right on time." "I heard you hired the Johnson brothers from the Veterans Center," Samantha said as she processed the payment. Ethan's eyes lit up. "Mike and Dave? They're incredible. Mike's a wizard with electrical work, and Dave can frame a wall faster than anyone I've ever seen. Plus," he paused, chuckling, "they've kind of become Lila's honorary uncles." As if on cue, the bank's door chimed, and Lila burst in wearing overalls and a tool belt size for a child. "Daddy, look what Mike made me." She proudly displayed her miniature tools, real ones, but smaller. "Careful with those, sweetheart," Ethan cautioned, but his pride was evident. "She's learning the trade," he explained to Samantha. "Already knows more about Phillips head versus flathead screwdrivers than I did at twice her age." Margaret emerged from her office, drawn by Lila's enthusiasm. The little girl ran to hug her, careful to keep her tool belt from swinging. "Miss Margaret, want to see my hammer? I helped fix Mrs. Peterson's garden fence today." "Did you now?" Margaret knelt to examine the tools. "My goodness, you're becoming quite the carpenter." "Daddy says I'm his best apprentice." Lila beamed, "Even if I can't spell it yet." The afternoon sun streamed through the bank's windows, catching the dust motes in golden light. Other customers smiled at the scene, the little girl in her work clothes, surrounded by adults who had learned to see past their differences to something greater. Later that evening, Ethan and Lila sat at their small kitchen table. The house still needed work, a fresh coat of paint here, new curtains there, but it felt more like home than ever. Their dinner was simple, meatloaf and mashed potatoes with green beans from the can. But the food wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the way Ethan's shoulders had lost their perpetual tension. What mattered was how Lila's stories tumbled out between bites, full of the day's adventures with Uncle Mike and Uncle Dave. What mattered was the sound that filled the kitchen. Ethan's laughter, rich and genuine, like a long-forgotten instrument finally being played again. Lila paused in her storytelling, her fork halfway to her mouth. She studied her father's face with that peculiar wisdom that sometimes shows itself in children. "See, Daddy, I told you we'd make it." The simple truth of her words hung in the air like a blessing. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They had made it not just to survival, but to something that felt remarkably like joy. The early summer evening wrapped the Veterans Center in golden light as people gathered on the freshly mowed lawn. Red, white, and blue banners fluttered from the newly repaired porch railings, and the scent of barbecue filled the air. Folding tables dotted the grounds, laden with covered dishes and desserts brought by townspeople. Ethan stood near the grill, flipping burgers alongside Tom, one of the veterans he'd hired. His worn work boots had been replaced by new ones, a gift from grateful customers, and his smile came easier these days. Lila darted between the tables, her pigtails bouncing as she helped arrange paper plates and plastic utensils. Margaret sat in a place of honor at the main table, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She'd traded her usual business attire for a comfortable floral dress, and her eyes sparkled as she chatted with elderly veterans who kept stopping by to thank her. "Mrs. Hayes," one old-timer said, leaning on his cane, "you did more than save a business. You saved our community center, too." He gestured at the solid roof above them. "First time in years it hasn't leaked when it rains." Margaret patted his hand. "Sometimes all people need is a chance to show what they're made of." A hush fell over the nearest tables as Samantha approached, clutching a Tupperware container. She wore a simple sundress instead of her usual sharp business suits, and her shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to make herself smaller. Her hands trembled as she set the container down. I brought cookies," she said softly. "My grandmother's recipe." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Margaret stood up and pulled out the chair next to her. Come sit with me, dear. Everyone loves cookies at a picnic. Color flooded Samantha's cheeks as she settled into the offered seat. I wasn't sure I should come, she admitted in a low voice. Margaret's eyes were kind as she opened the container, releasing the sweet smell of vanilla and chocolate chips. Grace isn't about forgetting, it's about beginning again. She selected a cookie and took a bite, and these are delicious. Across the lawn, Lila spotted them and ran over. Can I have one? She asked, looking at Samantha with innocent curiosity rather than the judgment the young banker had feared. Of course, Samantha said, her voice catching. She held out the container, and Lila grabbed 2 cookies. Thanks. Want me to take some to my dad? Before waiting for an answer, she was off again, weaving between groups of people. The tension began to ease as more people approached for cookies, each interaction helping to bridge the gap between past and present. Samantha gradually relaxed, even managing to laugh at one veteran's jokes about bank vaults. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Tom struck up some music on his guitar. Other veterans joined in with harmonicas and an old fiddle, their tunes ranging from patriotic songs to folk melodies. Children danced on the grass while adults tapped their feet and sang along. Ethan finished at the grill and made his way over to Margaret's table, carrying 2 plates loaded with burgers and sides. He set one in front of Margaret and, after a moment's hesitation, the other in front of Samantha. Thank you both, he said simply. For different reasons, but both important. Samantha blinked rapidly, looking down at her plate. I don't deserve. You told the truth when it mattered most, Ethan interrupted gently. That counts for a lot in my book. Margaret reached over and squeezed Samantha's hand. Around them, the music swelled as more people joined in, singing God Bless America. Lila's clear voice rang out above the others, slightly off-key but full of joy. The sky darkened to deep blue, and someone shouted, Time for the fireworks. People began spreading blankets on the grass or settling into lawn chairs. Ethan found Lila in the crowd and scooped her up onto his broad shoulders. She squealed with delight, her small hands resting on his head. The first rockets whistled skyward, bursting into brilliant red and gold sparks. The crowd oohed and awed as more followed, painting the night with cascading colors. The booms echoed off the center's restored roof, and the light played across faces turned upward in wonder. Margaret watched Ethan and Lila's silhouettes against the illuminated sky, their matching smiles bright enough to rival the fireworks. Samantha sat quietly beside her, peace finally settling into her features as she witnessed the beauty of second chances. Another burst of fireworks lit up the night, and cheers rose from the gathered crowd. The sound of celebration mixed with the lingering notes of music, the shared laughter of neighbors, and the quiet whispers of prayers answered, all rising together into the star-filled summer sky. The bell above the bank's entrance chimed softly as Ethan Carter pushed through the heavy glass doors, shaking snow from his new winter coat. The lobby of Midland Savings Bank gleamed with recent renovations, fresh paint on the walls, polished wooden counters, and holiday decorations that sparkled under modern lighting fixtures. He paused just inside, taking in how different everything looked from that desperate morning a year ago. The memory of walking in here with trembling hands and a folder full of dreams felt like another lifetime. Good morning, Ethan, Samantha Price called out from her desk, her smile genuine and warm. Gone was the cold superiority that had once defined her. Instead, she carried herself with a gentle confidence that put customers at ease. How's Lila doing with her school play? She's going to be the best tree in the Christmas pageant. Ethan chuckled, patting his jacket pocket where the check rested. Never knew a pine could have so many lines. I'm sure she'll steal the show, Samantha said, her eyes showing real interest. Margaret's in her office. She just finished a meeting. Thanks, Samantha. Ethan started toward the familiar corridor, then paused. Hey, those cookies you brought to Lila's birthday party last month? She's been asking when you'll make them again. A slight blush colored Samantha's cheeks. Tell her I'll bring a batch to the pageant. As Ethan walked down the hallway, he noticed how the bank's transformation mirrored the changes in all their lives. Where there had once been stark white walls, now warm earth tones created an inviting atmosphere. Local artists' work hung in simple frames, many depicting scenes of community life, including one of the Veterans Center with its newly restored roof. Margaret's office door stood open, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains she'd refused to replace during the renovation. She sat at her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed some papers. The same family photos still lined her shelves, but now they shared space with community service awards and a framed copy of the newspaper article about Ethan's success. He knocked gently on the doorframe. "Morning, Margaret." She looked up, her face brightening. "Ethan, come in, come in." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, the same chair where a year ago she'd listened to his story and taken a chance that would change both their lives. "Brought you something," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. The check felt solid in his hands, real proof of how far he'd come. He placed it carefully on her desk. Margaret picked up the check, and her eyes widened slightly as she read the amount. "First full-year profits," she murmured, pride evident in her voice. "I knew you could do it." "No," Ethan said softly. "You believed I could do it. There's a difference." He reached down and lifted the small potted plant he'd brought with him, a peace lily, its white flowers standing tall and strong against deep green leaves. He'd chosen it carefully, remembering how Margaret had once mentioned that her late husband used to bring her peace lilies on special occasions. "This is for you," he said, placing it on the corner of her desk. A small envelope rested against the pot, Margaret's name written in his careful handwriting. She opened the envelope with steady hands, though Ethan could see the emotion in her eyes as she unfolded the note. Her lips moved slightly as she read the words he'd written. "Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence held all the weight of their shared journey, the struggles, the victories, the moments of doubt, and the triumph of faith rewarded. Margaret removed her glasses, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "You know," she said, finally, her voice thick with emotion, "when I approved that loan, the numbers didn't add up on paper. But I saw something that day, something that couldn't be calculated in a spreadsheet." "What was that?" Ethan asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Hope," she replied simply, "and determination. The same things I see in this check." She carefully placed it in her desk drawer. "But more importantly, I see them in how you've helped rebuild this community, one repair at a time." Ethan nodded, thinking of all the homes he'd fixed, the families he'd helped, and the 2 veterans he now employed. It was never just about the repairs, was it? No. Margaret smiled, touching one of the peace lily's leaves. It was about rebuilding faith, in ourselves and in each other. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of customers in the lobby and the gentle hum of the heating system pushing back the winter chill. Through the window, snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny reminder of that first morning when a desperate father had walked into this bank with nothing but dreams and determination. Margaret carefully positioned the peace lily where sunlight would reach its leaves. "You know," she said, "I think this is exactly what this office needed." "What, a plant?" Ethan asked. "No," she replied, looking at him with motherly affection. "A reminder that sometimes the best investments we make aren't in things we can count." The snow outside was falling harder now, but inside Margaret's office, warmth and gratitude filled every corner. The peace lily stood as a quiet testament to their shared journey, its white flowers reaching upward, like hands raised in celebration or perhaps in prayer. Margaret stood by the window of her office, her weathered hand resting on the cold glass as she watched Ethan and Lila's figures move through the gently falling snow. The streetlights cast a warm, golden glow on the white dusted sidewalk, creating soft halos around their forms as they walked together down Main Street. Lila skipped every few steps, her red mittens reaching skyward as she tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue, her laughter carrying on the crisp winter air. Ethan carried a small paper bag from Murphy's Bakery down the street, their weekly tradition now, a treat to celebrate another successful week of his thriving handyman business. The sight brought a warm smile to Margaret's face, the kind that started deep in her chest and spread outward like ripples on still water. She fingered the note Ethan had left her earlier that afternoon, the paper simple and unadorned, nothing fancy about it. But the words carried more weight than any official bank document she'd ever handled in her 30-year career. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of a man who chose his words with the same precision he used to fix broken things. She carefully tucked it into her purse, planning to add it to her growing collection of precious memories in the special drawer of her desk at home, right next to the photo of her late husband and the thank you cards from other customers whose lives had been touched by a moment of unexpected kindness. The empty bank lobby echoed with her footsteps as she moved about, straightening chairs and tidying up for tomorrow's business. The cleaning crew had already come and gone, leaving behind the fresh scent of lemon polish that mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee from the break room. Through the tall windows that lined the front of the building, she could see Main Street transformed into a winter wonderland, with Christmas lights still twinkling in shop windows despite it being well past the holiday season. The town council had decided to keep them up through February, a small rebellion against the dreariness of winter that Margaret heartily approved of. She paused at Samantha's desk, now neat and organized in a way that spoke of newfound purpose rather than mere efficiency. Such a remarkable change from a year ago, when the young woman's workspace had been a fortress of cold professionalism. A small framed quote sat next to the computer monitor: "Kindness matters more than being right." Margaret smiled, remembering the day Samantha had brought it in, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and determination. The mentorship program had transformed them both, really. Teaching Samantha about compassionate banking had renewed Margaret's own sense of purpose, reminding her why she'd chosen this career in the first place. Not for the numbers, but for the people behind them. Moving toward the break room, Margaret paused to adjust the community bulletin board where local businesses posted their services. Ethan's simple business card was there, printed on sturdy cardstock. Carter Handyman Services, fixing what's broken, building what matters. Beneath it, testimonials from satisfied customers told the story of a man who did more than repair leaky faucets and squeaky hinges. He restored faith in honest work and genuine care. In the break room, Margaret washed her favorite coffee mug, the one with the faded inscription, "World's Best Teacher," a gift from her husband's students years ago that she couldn't bear to retire. She placed it back in its designated spot on the shelf. The room still held echoes of that morning's celebration. Crumbs from the congratulatory cake they'd shared to mark Ethan's successful first year. The sound of applause when he'd opened his books to show them the steady growth, month after month. She could still see the proud gleam in his eyes, the way his voice had caught when he'd thanked her for believing in him when no one else would. The potted plant Ethan had given her sat on her windowsill, its leaves reaching toward the last bits of fading daylight that filtered through the frost-touched glass. It was a peace lily, symbolic, she thought, of the peace that comes from doing what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The plant had grown remarkably in the past months, its glossy leaves a testament to the care she lavished on it, much like the attention she'd given to nurturing the community connections that had blossomed from one simple act of faith. Margaret gathered her coat and scarf from the wooden rack by her office door, wrapping them snugly around herself. The wool scarf had been a Christmas gift from Lila, hand-knitted with uneven stitches that made it all the more precious. Through the window, she could still make out Ethan and Lila in the distance, now turning the corner toward Maple Street, where their small rental house sat, nestled between towering oak trees. Their footprints in the fresh snow marked their path, a trail of purpose and belonging that would soon be covered by new falling flakes, nature's way of giving everyone a fresh start every single day. She thought about the ripples their story had created throughout the community, spreading outward like the circles. From a stone dropped in calm water, the Veterans Center was thriving now, its roof solid and its heating system humming efficiently thanks to Ethan's skilled hands and generous heart. He handled all their maintenance needs at reduced rates, understanding what it meant to serve those who had served others. 3 more small business loans had been approved under her new Character Counts initiative, each one carefully evaluated not just for credit scores and collateral, but for the intangible qualities that truly determine success: integrity, determination, and the willingness to serve something larger than oneself. The regional office had even asked her to develop training materials about community-based lending, turning her controversial decision into a model for other branches. The bank lobby felt peaceful in the evening, quiet, filled with the kind of sacred silence that comes at the end of meaningful work. Margaret's sensible heels clicked softly on the polished marble floor as she did her final walkthrough, a ritual she'd performed for years, but which now carried deeper significance. She checked each door, each window, more out of reverence than necessity. The security system hummed quietly in the background, ready to arm itself for the night and protect not just the building, but the dreams and aspirations housed within its files and records. At her office door, she paused one last time, her hand resting on the brass nameplate that read Margaret Hayes, branch manager. The view from here had witnessed so much over the years: triumph and tears, mistakes and miracles. The daily drama of human hopes and fears played out in loan applications and account statements. She thought about all the lives touched by one simple decision: to trust, to look beyond the surface numbers and see the person underneath, to believe in someone's potential rather than be limited by their past. It had been a risk that went against every policy manual and training seminar, but It had proven what she'd always known in her heart, that people were worth more than the sum of their financial statements. The snow continued to fall outside, each flake a tiny miracle of its own, unique and beautiful and purposeful. Margaret watched them dance in the warm light of the street lamps, their choreography both random and perfect, thinking how Faith was exactly like that, delicate yet persistent, each small act of kindness building upon another until the whole world looked different. She remembered her husband's words from years ago. Faith isn't about having all the answers, Maggie. It's about acting with love, even when you don't. She reached for the light switch, her hands steady and sure, despite the weight of all she'd learned this year about courage and consequence. In the growing darkness of her office, illuminated only by the gentle glow from the street outside, she whispered into the quiet, "Hope always finds a way." Before stepping into the snowy night, her heart was full, her faith unshaken, and her legacy secured not in any performance review or profit report, but in the lives she'd touched and the community she'd helped to heal, one act of kindness at a time. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Carter, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.